Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are diving into something absolutely wild. We're tearing apart the extreme science behind one of the most demanding, breathtaking, and, frankly, terrifying disciplines on the planet, downhill mountain biking. But we're not just looking at flashy videos. Thanks to biomechanical data from Kinexa and sports medicine insights from Dr. Christophe Delong, we're going to peel back the layers. We're getting into the raw physics, the crazy neurobiology, and the sheer human endurance it actually takes to survive a run.
I mean, just think about it for a second. How does your brain even process flying through a dense forest, dodging literal trees and jagged rocks at highway speeds? We're talking 80 kilometers per hour. In this environment, a single millisecond delay in reaction time doesn't just mean you lose a race, it means a catastrophic crash.
And to really put the stakes into perspective, let's look at the absolute limit, 167.6 kilometers per hour. Yep, you heard that right. That is the jaw-dropping world record set by Austrian rider Markus Stockel, flying down a literal volcano in Chile. Now, average race speeds usually hover around 40 to 80 kph depending on the terrain, but knowing humans can push a bike to these extremes proves we're dealing with life or death stakes on a daily basis.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start beyond the spectacle, check out the gravity machine, and then jump into a neurological symphony. From there, we'll look at defeating biology, compare stopwatch versus survival, and wrap up with the price of the extreme. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Beyond the spectacle.
Before these athletes were launching off 20-meter cliffs, things were a lot more, well, scrappy. The sport has incredibly humble, almost reckless beginnings back in the 1970s in Marin County, California. You had this group of hippies and thrill seekers bombing down Mount Tamalpais on heavy 1930s paperboy delivery bikes they called clunkers. They'd hold these legendary events called repack races. Why repack? Because their primitive coaster brakes would get so insanely hot that the grease inside the hubs would literally melt out. They had to repack them with fresh grease at the bottom of the hill. Needless to say, we moved from melting grease to aerospace-grade engineering.
Which brings us to Section 2, the gravity machine.
Today's downhill bike isn't just a bicycle. It is essentially an engineless Formula One car designed purely for the merciless pull of gravity. Looking at the analysis from Kinexa, surviving this requires a super open steering angle, around 63 degrees. This gives it a chopper effect for high-speed stability. The suspension boasts a massive 200 millimeters of travel, using double crown forks, just like a motocross bike, to soak up drops of several meters. And the brakes? They are 220mm 4-piston hydraulic monsters. They're so powerful you could eject yourself right over the handlebars with just one finger. Plus, a lot of riders run a mullet tire setup, a big 29-inch wheel up front to smash through rock gardens, and a smaller 27.5-inch wheel in the back for sharp agility.
Section 3. A neurological symphony.
Steering that machine through a rock garden isn't just about raw muscle. It's about a brain operating in absolute overdrive. Dr. Christophe Delong points out something fascinating. When a bike slides at 60 kilometers per hour, it's not a loss of control, it's a negotiation of friction. Long before the conscious brain registers anything, sensors in the skin and joints feel a tiny change in vibration. That data shoots to the cerebellum, which acts like a supercomputer. It uses a forward model to actually predict the slide and pre-activate opposing muscles. Then a spinal reflex triggers a neuromuscular response. The rider countersteers faster than conscious thought, all while their legs are modulating pressure on the pedals like 15 times a second to find traction. It is a true biological masterpiece.
But here's the catch. To let those lightning-fast reflexes work, the rider has to get out of their own way. This requires a clinical state called transient hypofrontality. In plain English, it's the ultimate flow state. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that does slow, analytical thinking and, crucially, creates doubt and fear, intentionally shuts down. Athletes actually induce this temporary madness so their primitive, rapid brain structures can take full control. Otherwise, the conscious mind would just be screaming at them to hit the brakes.
Section 4. Defeating biology.
While the brain is in flow, the body is basically at war. Downhill riding subjects the human anatomy to brutal forces it simply wasn't designed for. Kinexa's biomechanical tracking highlights this crazy battle against isometric tension. Riders aren't sitting and pedaling, they're standing. Their legs and core are locked in a permanent state of isometric contraction, while simultaneously absorbing violent shocks from the ground. That's an eccentric effort. To survive, they use stiffness control. They completely decouple their body from the bike, using their arms as living hydraulic shock absorbers. If their arms are too stiff, the vibrations literally blur their vision. If they're too loose, the handlebars get ripped right out of their hands. And on top of all that, they have to maintain incredible neural independence, gripping the bars for dear life while keeping just their index finger perfectly supple to finesse those brakes.
But eventually, physiology fights back. The ultimate enemy out there is arm pump. This is an excruciating physiological failure. Constant, intense gripping compresses the veins in the forearm. Your heart keeps pumping fresh, oxygenated blood in, but the old blood and toxins can't get out. Your forearms literally turn to stone. The rider loses all sensation and can't even open their hands. Elite riders actually have to perform micro-releases of their grip while they're flying through the air off jumps just to get a millisecond of blood flush so they can survive the rest of the run.
Moving on to Section 5, Stopwatch versus Survival.
These extreme physical demands have actually split the downhill world into two completely different philosophies. On one side, you have the UCI World Cup. This is the Formula One of the sport. It's all about the stopwatch. Riders take highly calculated risks, keeping their wheels buried in the dirt as much as possible to hunt down literal hundredths of a second with clinical precision. But on the other side, free ride, epitomized by the Red Bull Rampage. No stopwatch here. It's judged purely on artistry and survival. Riders are sculpting their own lines down near vertical desert cliffs and throwing tricks off 20-meter drops. A World Cup racer might look at a Rampage drop and say, "No way," and a Rampage rider would likely finish seconds behind in a World Cup race. They are entirely different breeds of extreme.
But there is one brutal meeting point where these worlds collide, the Red Bull Hardline. This event forces riders to race against the clock on a track packed with Rampage-sized, massive obstacles. It is the ultimate hybrid test. Only the absolute most versatile and fearless riders in the world can even make it to the finish line intact.
Finally, Section 6, the price of the extreme.
Zooming out from the mechanics to take a clinical look at the reality of this sport. It's heavy. Dr. Christophe Delong emphasizes that in downhill, it is never a question of if you will crash, but when and what you're going to break. The collarbone is incredibly common. It actually acts almost as a bodily fuse, snapping to dissipate energy and protect your spine when you fly over the handlebars. But the darker reality is the invisible micro-concussions from those high-speed impacts that threaten long-term health. At freeride events like Rampage, the stakes are so vertically terrifying that a medical medevac helicopter literally sits there with its engines running, a constant reminder of the catastrophic risks.
And what's truly terrifying, from a psychiatric perspective, is the mental toll of returning to the bike. After a severe crash, a normal human develops an aversion to that risk. It's basic survival. But these athletes have to perform what our sources call reprogramming the amygdala. They consciously override their brain's fear center. They have to completely ignore their trauma just to repeat the exact high-speed actions that put them in the hospital in the first place. It is a completely unnatural psychological feat.
The source material also neutrally presents a stark medical perspective on the business of all this, referring to the industry side as the marketing of hemoglobin. It's a critique of the sponsor model, highlighting the dynamic where brands essentially monetize the vital risk taken by these athletes. Think about it. Sponsors gain massive visibility whether the rider succeeds brilliantly or crashes spectacularly. But once the cameras turn off, the athlete alone bears the permanent physical consequences. So why do they keep pushing it? Unpacking the psychological drivers, the sources point to some profound realities. Many of these riders develop an addiction to endogenous opiates. That's the massive dopamine and endorphin rush the brain releases when you survive a mortal danger. Normal life can just feel numb by comparison. This can lead to ordaelic behavior, where risking your life becomes a necessary act just to feel alive. Paired with the intense pressure for social media validation, athletes are constantly pushed to up the stakes, sometimes completely overriding their basic human instinct for self-preservation.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. When we tune in to watch these athletes defy gravity, push the absolute limits of human neurobiology, and risk their lives for our entertainment, are we just watching a sport, or have we created a modern version of gladiator fights? It is a heavy thought, but one that absolutely changes how you view the incredible, terrifying anatomy of a downhill champion. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.